I am Richard Big, though everyone in the high-stakes commercial real estate world knows me simply as Dick. I am 70 years old, and I recently inherited a rundown rotting farm from my late wife, while my son received our $12 million penthouse in Los Angeles. My own flesh and blood called me a useless old man and threw me out onto the street. So, I decided to drive out and spend the night at that abandoned farm. But when I pushed open the heavy wooden door, I froze completely at what I saw hidden inside. Before I continue this story, please let me know which city or country you are watching from in the comments below. It brings a lot of warmth to this old man's heart to know where my listeners are joining me from. And please, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. If you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth, I promise you what I am about to tell. You will change the way you look at the people closest to you forever. Let me take you back to the exact moment my entire reality shattered. It was a gloomy Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I buried my beautiful wife, Sarah. We had been married for 40 incredible years, 4 decades of shared dreams, building a massive real estate portfolio from scratch, and creating what I genuinely believed was a rock-solid, loving family. I had stepped down as the chairman of my firm a few years prior, willingly giving up my hard-earned career just so I could care for Sarah during her final grueling battle with illness. I loved her more than life itself, and I would have traded all my wealth and success just to have one more healthy day with her by my side. I was sitting in the freezing glass-walled office of our longtime estate attorney, Gregory Pierce. The room felt sterile and lifeless, completely devoid of the warmth that Sarah always brought into any room she entered. Across the heavy mahogany conference table sat my son, Cameron, and his wife, Monica. They were dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored designer clothing, checking their expensive watches, and looking more like they were preparing for an exclusive red carpet event than mourning the recent loss of a mother. I sat there in my simple black suit, feeling the heavy exhaustion of grief weighing down my bones. I expected this reading of the will to be a simple, mundane formality. Sarah and I had always discussed our estate planning together over morning coffee. I assumed the core assets would remain in my control to manage until my time eventually came, and then it would seamlessly pass down to Cameron. Gregory cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked down at the thick stack of legally binding documents. His voice was completely flat and monotonous, entirely detached from the emotional bomb he was about to detonate in the middle of that room. He started by reading the clause regarding our primary residence, the $12 million luxury penthouse in downtown Los Angeles. I knew that property inside and out. I had paid for it in pure cash 10 years ago, designing every single inch of it alongside Sarah so it could be our perfect forever home with panoramic views of the city skyline. Gregory stated clearly, reading the precise legal jargon without any hesitation, that full ownership and title of the Los Angeles penthouse was to be transferred immediately to Cameron and Monica. I blinked hard, genuinely believing that my 70-year-old ears were playing a cruel trick on me. I waited for Gregory to correct himself to mention my life estate, or at least my continued right to reside in the home I bought. But he did not. He just kept reading, moving right past it, as if my 40 years of marriage and financial contributions meant absolutely nothing. And then he reached the portion of the will regarding my inheritance. According to the document, I, the man who had loved, protected, and provided for Sarah every day of her adult life, was left with nothing but an abandoned, rotting farm out in Ohio. It was a desolate, overgrown piece of property, a full 2 hours away from the city, a barren plot of dirt we had acquired years ago and completely forgotten about. I leaned forward slowly, my hands gripping the armrests of my leather chair so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I looked at Gregory, my voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of deep grief and absolute confusion. I asked him politely to stop reading, asking if there was some sort of clerical mistake, some drafting error that had accidentally swapped the names. Before Gregory could even open his mouth to answer my question, Cameron lunged across the large table and violently snatched the document right out of the attorney's hands. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that echoed off the cold glass walls of the office. In that single terrifying second, the mask of the grieving, supportive son completely vanished. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated disdain. I will never forget the absolute coldness in his stare. A stare that made my blood run cold. "You heard the man," Dad Cameron said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "The penthouse is ours now. There is no mistake. Mom finally saw things clearly before she died. She knew you were losing your edge, losing your mind. And frankly, a useless old man like you has no business living in a $12 million property." The room started spinning. The boy I had taught to ride a bike, the son I had proudly put through the finest business schools in America. The child I had sacrificed my own sleep to comfort when he was sick was looking at me like I was a piece of garbage taking up space. I tried to speak to demand an explanation, but the shock completely suffocated me. Cameron leaned in closer, aggressively, tapping the heavy legal paper against the polished wood table. "You need to go home. Pack your bags and be out of my property by 5 this evening," he demanded, narrowing his eyes. "Monica and I are hosting a private dinner for some very important VIP clients tonight. We are closing a massive deal, and we absolutely do not have the time or the patience to deal with a senile old fool wandering around the living room and ruining our image." I was entirely numb. My chest ached with a pain far worse than any physical injury I had ever sustained. I do not even remember the long car ride back to the penthouse. I just remember the deeply humiliating blur of throwing 40 years of my beautiful life into 2 small travel suitcases. I was forced to pack my most basic belongings while my son's hired private security detail stood by the bedroom door, watching my every move as if I were a common thief stealing from a hotel. By 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the grand marble hallway by the front elevators, literally being pushed out of the very home I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy brass elevator doors chimed, ready to take me down to the lobby and out of their lives forever. Just as I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, feeling completely defeated, Monica stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. She wore a sickening, victorious smirk that made my stomach churn. She reached into the pocket of her expensive designer blazer and shoved a small, unmarked prescription bottle roughly into my hand. "Sarah's dying wish," Monica whispered, leaning uncomfortably close to my ear so the security guards could not hear. "Take 2 a day for your heart, old man. Have a safe drive to nowhere." The heavy brass doors slid shut, sealing me out of the life I had built. I stood there in the polished marble hallway, the cold surface of the unmarked plastic bottle pressing into my palm. Monica's cruel whisper echoed in my ears as I gripped the handle of my suitcase and made my way down to the underground parking garage. The descent felt like a funeral march. I found my beat-up Ford pickup truck parked between 2 gleaming European sports cars. It was a relic from my early days in construction, a truck I kept purely out of nostalgia and a stubborn refusal to forget where I came from. I tossed my bags onto the passenger seat and climbed behind the steering wheel. The leather was worn, smelling faintly of old coffee and sawdust. I sat there in the dim fluorescent lighting, staring at the small white pills inside the clear plastic container. There was no label, no dosage instructions, no pharmacy stamp, just smooth white tablets. My mind was racing, trying to process the absolute whiplash of the last 2 hours. Sarah and I had built an empire together. We had shared every financial decision, every triumph, and every burden. How could she secretly draft a will that left me destitute while handing our crown jewel over to a son who looked at me with such venom it did not make sense? Sarah was a meticulous woman. She was a former forensic accountant who scrutinized every contract and every bank statement we ever signed. Leaving me with a decaying farm in Ojai and a bottle of mystery pills was completely contrary to the woman I had loved for 40 years. I needed answers. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over Cameron's name. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my hand and pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. I expected him to bark at me to ask why I was bothering him when he was busy preparing for his very important clients. Instead, I heard the faint clinking of expensive crystal glasses in the background and the soft murmur of unfamiliar voices. Then Cameron spoke. The sheer hostility from the lawyer's office was completely gone. In its place was an overly warm, sickeningly sweet tone that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Dad," he said, his voice projecting loudly through the speakerphone, "I am so glad you called back. Monica and I were just talking about you. Are you doing all right, Pop? Do you need us to call a car service to help you get out to the country?" I gripped the steering wheel, grinding my teeth. He was putting on a show. He was playing the role of the deeply concerned, loving son for his wealthy guests. "Cameron," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, "what is going on? Why did your mother leave the penthouse to you? We built that home together. And what exactly are these pills?" Monica shoved into my hand. Cameron let out a soft, patronizing sigh, perfectly calibrated to sound like a man bearing the heavy burden of an aging parent. "Oh, Dad," he murmured sympathetically. "We talked about this at the lawyer's office. Remember, Mom did this to protect you. She knew you were struggling to keep up with things lately." I frowned completely, thrown off balance by his calm demeanor. Protect me by throwing me out on the street. Protect me by sending me to a rotting farmhouse 2 hours away from my doctors and my community. "Yes, Dad," Cameron replied smoothly, his tone remarkably patient. "Think about it logically for a second. The property taxes and the homeowner association fees on this penthouse run close to $200,000 a year. You are 70 years old and living on a fixed retirement income. Now, if Mom had left this property in your name, the city and the banks would have drained your savings within a year. You would have gone bankrupt trying to maintain a $12 million asset all by yourself." I sat silently in the driver's seat, listening to the hum of the garage ventilation system. His words hit me like a splash of cold water. From a strictly financial perspective, it made a brutal kind of sense. Sarah had always been ruthlessly pragmatic about taxes and asset protection. Could she have made a cold, calculated decision to preserve my small cash reserves by offloading the massive liability of the penthouse onto Cameron? "Have peace and quiet in Ojai." Cameron continued softly, leaning into the silence. "She wanted you to spend your golden years away from the smog and the noise of the city, resting on a quiet piece of land. And those pills, Dad, please do not be stubborn about them. You know your memory has been slipping lately. You have been forgetting names, misplacing your keys, getting confused during conversations. Mom was terrified about your cognitive decline. She spent a fortune having those high-end Swiss cognitive supplements special ordered for you as before she passed. She made Monica promise to make sure you took them, 2 a day just like she wanted. Please take them, Dad. For Mom." I closed my eyes. Was I really losing my mind? Had my grief made me paranoid, turning my own son into a villain that simply because I was hurt by a practical financial decision, I did not have the energy to fight him anymore? I told him I would call him when I arrived in Ojai and ended the call. I sat in the dim light of the truck cabin for a long time. The logic of his arguments slowly settled into my tired brain. It was a harsh reality, but perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was just a tired old man who needed to accept his new reality. I popped the cap off the plastic bottle, tapped a single smooth white tablet into my palm, and swallowed it dry with a quick sip of lukewarm water from a water bottle in my cup holder. I started the engine, put the truck in gear, and drove out of the underground garage, leaving my entire life behind me. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon as I merged onto the Pacific Coast Highway. The rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline usually brought me comfort, but today the sound felt distant and muffled. 40 minutes into the drive along the winding coastal road, the world outside my windshield began to warp. My vision blurred violently, turning the bright orange sunset into a smeared, chaotic painting. A sudden, terrifying cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and my hands started shaking so violently that I could barely maintain my grip on the leather steering wheel. I gasped, realizing my heart rate was dropping dangerously low, feeling like my chest was filling with heavy cement. I slammed the brake pedal, the tires screaming, and jerked the truck onto the gravel shoulder before the world faded into darkness. I woke up with a sudden violent gasp, my lungs burning as if I had been submerged underwater for hours. Weist on my hands gripped the steering wheel knuckles, aching from holding the worn leather. The truck cabin was completely dark, save for the faint dashboard lights illuminating the heavy beads of sweat rolling down my forehead. I blinked rapidly, trying to force my eyes to focus through the thick, unnatural fog that had taken over my mind. My heart was pounding against my ribs, an erratic rhythm that felt entirely wrong. I checked the dashboard clock. It was nearly 7 in the evening. I had been unconscious on the highway shoulder for over 3 hours. I rolled down the window, letting the cold ocean breeze hit my face. The crisp air acted like a physical slap, slowly pulling my senses back. I am 70 years old, but I spent 35 years as a commercial real estate developer. My career was built on spotting discrepancies, identifying risks, and reading people trying to hide the truth. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes as the puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Cameron and Monica did not care about my cognitive health. Those white tablets were not high-end Swiss memory supplements ordered by my wife. They were heavy, dangerous sedatives, or something worse. They had deliberately handed me unmarked narcotics right before I merged onto a treacherous, winding coastal highway. If my reflexes had been even a fraction of a second slower, my truck would have plummeted off the cliffs and into the ocean. It would have looked like a tragic accident. A grieving, senile old man who lost control of his vehicle. I reached into the passenger seat, my trembling fingers finding the plastic bottle. A surge of pure anger washed over me, burning away the remaining fog in my mind. I hurled the bottle into the darkness. I listened to it clatter against the rocks and disappear into the crashing waves. I took a deep breath, gripped the gear shift, and pulled my truck back onto the highway. I was no longer a confused, grieving widower. I was a man who had just survived an attempted execution by his own flesh and blood. The rest of the drive inland was a blur of dark, winding roads. I left the ocean behind, navigating the steep routes deep into the Ojai Valley. By the time my GPS indicated I was approaching the property, the sun had dipped below the mountain ridgeline, casting long, eerie shadows. I turned off the paved road and onto a rugged dirt driveway, entirely choked with overgrown weeds. The branches of dying oak trees scraped aggressively against my truck as I crept forward. After a mile, the dense tree line broke, revealing the property Sarah had left me. I shifted into park and stared through the dusty windshield. It looked like a setting from a cheap horror movie. The main farmhouse was a decaying structure. The porch roof had caved in. The wooden siding was rotting, and every window was either boarded up or shattered. Tall grass swallowed the front steps, and a rusted tractor sat abandoned in the side yard. It was a desolate wasteland. This was the peace and quiet Cameron had smugly talked about. A property so worthless that no one would ever come looking for me. I stepped out, the crunch of dry gravel echoing in the stillness of the valley. The air here was entirely different from the coast. It was dry still and completely devoid of life. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from behind my seat to cut through the encroaching darkness. I walked around the perimeter of the farmhouse, shining the light over the collapsed roof and cracked foundation. Me evaluating properties was practically woven into my DNA. I automatically started assessing the structural integrity, foundation, settling, and roof load. The house was beyond repair. It was a complete tear-own. There was no logical reason for Sarah, a brilliant forensic accountant who managed our assets with ruthless precision, to hold on to a dead property like this for a decade. It made zero financial sense. She hated dead assets. She hated paying taxes on useless land. Why would she secretly keep this ruin? And why would she specifically single it out to be my sole inheritance? I continued walking past the main house, my boots crunching over dead branches and scattered debris. The property extended far back into a dense cluster of towering trees. As I moved away from the farmhouse, my flashlight beam swept across the ground, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My developer instincts, honed over 3 decades of inspecting construction sites, flared violently to life. The narrative Cameron had spun was falling apart right beneath my feet. The driveway leading up to the main house was covered in years of untouched, overgrown brush. But the path leading past the house, curving toward the back of the property, was different. I crouched down, shining the light directly onto the dirt. The earth here was deeply compacted and heavily rooted. These were not the tracks of a lost hiker or a wandering local. These were fresh, deep, heavy-duty truck tire tracks, the kind made by commercial utility vehicles carrying massive payloads, and there were dozens of them overlapping each other, creating a clear, recently used road right through the mud. I stood up, my heart beginning to race again, but this time not from the sedatives. I followed the heavy tracks, letting them guide me deeper into the property. The trees parted again, revealing a massive looming structure situated at the very back of the lot. It was a large corrugated metal barn. The exterior was cleverly painted and weathered to look just as abandoned and rusted as the main farmhouse. It blended in perfectly with the desolate environment. But as I walked closer, shining my light along the side of the structure, my breath caught in my throat. Running down the side of an old wooden utility pole hidden in the trees was a thick black electrical cable. I followed the cable with my flashlight as it swooped down and connected directly into the side of the rusted barn. It was a brand new industrial-grade 3-phase power line. In commercial real estate, you only run 3-phase power lines for specific reasons. You run them when you need to support heavy manufacturing equipment, massive industrial refrigeration units, or high-density computer server farms. You do not install industrial power grids into an abandoned rotting barn in the middle of nowhere. I slowly lowered my flashlight, stepping closer to the massive metal doors of the barn. The air around the structure felt different. There was a faint, almost imperceptible, low-frequency hum vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. Someone was drawing a massive amount of electricity into this supposed ruin. Why is there a brand-new industrial-grade 3-phase power line running into an abandoned barn? And why are there fresh, heavy-duty truck tire tracks heading straight for the back of the property? I had to find out what was inside. I turned away from the heavy metal doors of the mysterious barn and slowly made my way back toward the decaying farmhouse. The crisp evening air had grown noticeably colder as night fully descended upon the quiet Ojai Valley. My heavy work boots crunched softly over the dry, overgrown weeds and deeply cracked earth. I needed to get inside the main house immediately. I needed to sit down in a secure place and mentally process the sheer magnitude of the baffling anomalies I had just uncovered out back. I approached the wooden porch and forcefully pushed open the front door of the main house. Its severely rusted hinges shrieked violently into the otherwise quiet night, sounding eerily like an injured animal crying out in the dark. The interior of the house smelled intensely of stale dust, spreading dry rot, and countless years of absolute unforgiving neglect. I stepped inside and swept the bright beam of my heavy metal flashlight across the desolate living room. The faded floral wallpaper was peeling off the walls in long yellowed strips, and the uneven floorboards groaned loudly under my shifting weight. There was a single tattered armchair sitting perfectly in the center of the dark room, covered completely by a thin white sheet that had turned a sickly gray color with age. I reached out and pulled the dirty sheet away, sending a thick cloud of dust particles into the stale air, and sank heavily into the worn cushions. My mind was spinning relentlessly. The industrial 3-phase power line, the fresh heavy-duty tire tracks in the mud, the completely uncharacteristic behavior of my highly organized, pragmatic late wife. Absolutely none of it made any logical sense. Yet, All these hidden clues pointed directly to something massive and highly secretive being hidden right here on this forgotten piece of land. Before I could even begin to piece together a rational theory, the sudden shrill ringing of my cell phone violently shattered the dead silence of the isolated farmhouse. I flinched physically, my tired heart suddenly jumping directly into my throat. The sudden digital noise was absolutely deafening in the empty, echoing room. I quickly pulled the phone from my jacket pocket, fully expecting to see Gregory, the cold estate attorney, calling to arrogantly finalize some leftover legal paperwork from the morning. Instead, the bright glowing screen displayed a name that instantly made my blood run entirely cold. It was Monica, my incredibly cruel daughter-in-law. The exact same woman who just a few short hours ago had shoved a suspicious bottle of heavy sedatives directly into my hand and practically kicked me out onto the street with a vicious, triumphant smirk on her face. Why on earth would she be calling me now deep into the evening? I stared blankly at the glowing screen as the phone vibrated repeatedly against my palm. Every single survival instinct I had painstakingly developed over 3 decades in the cutthroat commercial real estate industry screamed at me not to answer her call. But a deeper, much more strategic voice in my head firmly told me to pick it up immediately. I needed to know exactly what she wanted. I cleared my throat forcefully, forcing my tense facial muscles to relax, and slowly swiped the green button to accept the unexpected call. I brought the digital device up to my ear and let out a soft, tired greeting. I barely recognized the distinct voice that responded on the other end of the line. "Dad." "Oh, thank goodness you finally answered the phone. Did you make it there safely?" Monica asked breathlessly. Her vocal tone was completely unrecognizable to me now. The venomous, icy condescension from the luxury penthouse hallway was entirely gone. In its place was an overly sweet, highly frantic, and almost desperate level of parental concern. Her voice was pitched artificially high, fluttering with a feigned, dramatic anxiety that instantly made my skin crawl with discomfort. It was a calculated performance, a terribly transparent and poorly acted one, but I decided to play along with her twisted game. "Yes, Monica," I muttered softly, intentionally making my voice sound incredibly slow, weak, and extremely heavy. "I made it. I am currently inside the farmhouse." "Oh, I am so incredibly relieved," she continued, speaking entirely too fast for a normal conversation. "Listen, Dad, I was just wondering, have you walked around the outer property yet? Did you happen to go into the old barn out back? Mom always talked fondly about that specific barn. Did she perhaps leave anything interesting in there for you? Did you open the big doors?" The aggressive specificity of her rapid-fire questions hit me like a physical heavy blow to the stomach. She did not actually care if I had miraculously survived the treacherous drive down the highway. She did not care about my failing health or my deep grief. She only cared about the barn, the very same barn secretly connected to a massive industrial power grid. I knew instantly that this sudden phone call was a carefully constructed trap. If I told her the absolute truth, if I foolishly told her I saw the fresh tire tracks and the thick electrical cables, I would undeniably be signing my own death warrant tonight. I needed to make her confidently believe that her cruel pharmacological plan had worked flawlessly. I needed her to firmly believe that I was exactly what Cameron had arrogantly called me earlier today. A clueless, useless old man who posed zero threat. I slouched much deeper into the dusty armchair, pressing the phone tightly against my ear, and let out a long, pathetic groan. I slurred carefully chosen words, heavily dragging out my syllables to sound utterly exhausted, mentally defeated, and deeply confused. "No. Monica," I mumbled weakly, forcing my vocal cords to tremble realistically. "I did not go outside at all. I am so incredibly tired right now. Those special pills you generously gave me earlier, they made me so incredibly dizzy on the road. My vision is entirely blurred right now. I can barely even stand up straight without falling over. I just dragged my heavy body into the living room and collapsed into a chair. I think I am going to sleep for a solid week." I cannot even begin to think about walking out into the dark to explore some old barn right now. I just need to close my heavy eyes and rest my body. There was a sharp, sudden, and highly calculating pause on the other end of the telephone line. I could distinctly hear her breathing rapidly, calculating her next strategic move in the dark. When she finally spoke again, the frantic, desperate edge in her voice had completely vanished, replaced quickly by a smooth, chillingly dark satisfaction. "Oh, Dad, I am so deeply sorry. The long drive took so much out of your system," she cooed softly, sounding deeply and genuinely relieved by my fake symptoms. "You just rest now. Do not worry about exploring the property tonight. Just stay securely inside the house and sleep deeply. We will talk again in a few days. Goodbye." The line instantly went dead. She did not say she loved me. She did not offer to drive up and check on me. She just coldly hung up, entirely satisfied that the heavy, unmarked sedatives had done their sinister job perfectly. I lowered the silent phone slowly, staring blankly into the dark, empty room. The terrifying pieces were finally locking into a cohesive place. The mysterious pills were specifically meant to incapacitate my body, to keep me entirely out of the way, or perhaps to make absolutely sure I never woke up from my sleep at all. They wanted me to be completely physically helpless tonight. I stood up slowly from the dusty armchair, my sharp mind racing wildly with terrifying, dangerous possibilities. If Monica was so desperately concerned about whether or not I had entered that specific barn, it meant there was something incredibly valuable hidden inside it that she and my treacherous son desperately needed tonight. Something they were more than willing to chemically drug me for. I walked slowly across the loudly creaking floorboards, moving quietly toward the front of the isolated farmhouse. The large bay window in the front living room was heavily covered in decades of thick grime and featured several large, dangerous cracks running diagonally through the fragile glass. I carefully peeked through a relatively clear section of the broken pane, looking out into the expansive, totally overgrown front yard and the long, winding dirt road leading all the way back to the main highway. The bright moon had finally risen, casting a pale silver glow over the silent valley. The dark night was incredibly still and peaceful. I scanned the distant horizon carefully, actively searching for any sign of approaching movement. At first, there was absolutely nothing out there but the gentle swaying of the dry brush moving in the cold wind. But then my sharp eyes caught something moving ominously in the far distance. About a mile down the rugged, uneven dirt road, two bright, glaring headlights forcefully pierced through the thick darkness. A large vehicle was steadily approaching the isolated property. I held my breath tightly, watching the lights intently. Suddenly, the bright headlights snapped off entirely, plunging the approaching vehicle into total absolute darkness. But the faint, highly rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling aggressively over loose gravel continued echoing in the silent night. I squinted hard through the cracked, dirty glass, my racing heart hammering furiously and painfully against my ribcage. A large, menacing black SUV slowly emerged from the deep shadows of the treeing. It was creeping deliberately toward the farmhouse at a predatory, agonizingly slow pace, operating entirely in stealth mode without any lights. They had not come all this way just to check on my physical well-being. They had come to violently finish the job. The massive black vehicle rolled to a silent stop near the edge of the overgrown gravel driveway, barely 100 yards from the decaying front porch where I stood hidden behind the cracked glass. The engine was cut immediately. They sat in the dark, observing the farmhouse, waiting for a response. My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind rapidly shifted into a state of cold, calculated survival. My immediate urge was to dial 911 and beg the local authorities to send a patrol car. But I stopped my thumb. Cameron was not just a greedy, entitled son anymore. He was a highly connected, wealthy executive who routinely rubbed elbows with local politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. He funded political campaigns across Southern California. If I called the local police in a panic, claiming my son sent hitmen to a remote farm. It was entirely possible the responding officers were already on his payroll. Or worse, they would simply write me off as a delusional old man, suffering from a severe cognitive breakdown. Exactly the narrative Monica had been planting. I could not risk placing my life in the hands of strangers who might be bought and paid for. I needed someone I could trust implicitly. I needed someone who knew how to handle a violent, life-threatening situation in the dead of night. I scrolled quickly past the emergency numbers on my phone and found the contact for Victor. Victor and I had been best friends for over 40 years. Before entering the private security sector, he spent 2 decades as a highly decorated reconnaissance Marine, serving in the most hostile environments on the planet. If anyone knew how to handle a tactical ambush, it was him. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing shallow. The line rang only twice before he answered. His voice was growly and alert. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "Victor," I whispered into the receiver, my voice trembling slightly. "I am in serious trouble. I am out at the old high property, the one Sarah bought years ago. There is a black vehicle parked right outside the tree, operating entirely in stealth mode. They killed their headlights before pulling up, and they are just sitting there. I think Cameron sent them to get rid of me." There was absolute silence on the other end. Victor did not ask if I was joking. He did not ask if I was overreacting to the shadows. He simply processed the tactical information instantly. "Give me your exact coordinates, Dick," he said, his tone shifting into icy military efficiency. I recited the address from memory, my eyes never leaving the vehicle outside. "I am 20 minutes away if I push the engine," Victor replied. "Do not engage them under any circumstances. Keep your phone silent. Stay out of sight and find a heavy weapon, just in case they breach the perimeter before I arrive." "I am on my way." He hung up. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and slowly backed away from the front window, placing each footstep with agonizing care to avoid the creaking floorboards. Either I needed a weapon, something heavy and solid that could do actual damage if I was forced into a physical confrontation. I moved silently through the dark hallway toward the rear of the house, letting my memory of the floor plan guide my movements. The kitchen was a desolate space, bathed in the pale moonlight, filtering through dirty back windows. I ran my hands over the decaying countertops and opened a few rusted drawers, finding nothing but brittle wood and ancient dust. Then my foot brushed against something cold and solid resting on the floor near the door. I crouched down and swept my hand over the linoleum, my fingers wrapping around a heavy iron crowbar. It was covered in rust and old paint left behind by whoever boarded up the house years ago, but it was perfectly balanced and incredibly dangerous in the right hands. I gripped the cold iron tightly, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline flood my tired muscles. I was 70 years old, but I was absolutely not going to simply lie down and let my incredibly ungrateful son order my execution without putting up a brutal, bloody fight. I pressed my back against the kitchen wall and carefully reached for the brass handle of the rear door. It was stiff fighting against my grip, but I applied steady pressure until the latch finally clicked open with a barely audible metallic pop. I eased the door open just wide enough to slip my body through the narrow gap and stepped quietly out into the freezing night air. The backyard was heavily overgrown with thick brush and tall dead grass, providing me with excellent natural cover. I crouched down low, letting the dense vegetation conceal my silhouette, and slowly maneuvered my way around the side of the house toward the front driveway. I moved with agonizing caution, ensuring my heavy boots did not snap any dry twigs. When I finally reached the corner of the rotting porch, I peered carefully through the bushes. The doors of the black vehicle quietly swung open. 2 men stepped out onto the gravel. They were not common street thugs or cheap local criminals. They were dressed in high-end black tactical gear from head to toe. They wore heavy Kevlar vests, dark combat boots, and black fabric masks that completely covered their faces. In their hands, they carried sleek firearms equipped with long cylindrical sound suppressors. These men were highly trained, heavily armed professionals, moving with terrifying synchronized military precision. They communicated entirely through subtle hand signals, their movements devoid of hesitation. One of the men reached into a tactical pouch on his chest and pulled out a complex electronic device. Even from my hidden vantage point, I recognized the distinct glowing interface of a biometric bypass scanner. It was a highly specialized piece of equipment used exclusively by high security firms to hack into advanced digital locking mechanisms. Why would a hit squad need a biometric scanner to break into a decaying farmhouse? The terrifying answer presented itself almost immediately. The two armed men did not turn toward the front porch. They did not even glance at the broken windows of the main house, where they supposedly believed I was sleeping off a heavy dose of narcotics. Instead, they completely bypassed the residential structure, turning their backs to the farmhouse entirely. They raised their suppressed weapons to a ready position and began marching silently through the muddy grass, heading directly toward the massive metal barn at the far edge of the property. They were completely and utterly ignoring me. They were going straight for whatever my wife Sarah had hidden behind those heavy doors. I tightened my grip on the rusted iron crowbar, my breathing shallow and controlled. I waited until they were 50 yards ahead, their dark figures blending into the night before I stepped out from the dense brush. I lowered my center of gravity and began to follow them into the darkness, stepping precisely in their muddy footprints to avoid making a sound. The cold night air bit into my lungs as I crept forward, keeping my boots firmly planted in the deep impressions left by the armed intruders. The tall, dying grass brushed against my dark jacket, but I moved with agonizing slowness to ensure not a single blade snapped under my weight. 50 yards became 15. I could clearly see the faint green lights on their tactical vests. They were standing right in front of the massive corrugated metal doors of the barn, speaking to each other in hushed, clipped tones. One adjusted the biometric scanner near the door frame, while the other kept his suppressed weapon raised. My grip on the rusted iron crowbar was so tight my forearms cramped. I was 70 years old. I was in good shape, but pitting myself against two highly trained professionals in their physical prime was practically suicide. Yet the thought of Cameron sending ghosts to murder me completely erased my fear. I was about to step out from behind a rotting tractor tire to swing the heavy iron bar at the nearest guard when a sudden silent shadow detached itself from the dense treeing to my right. A large hand clamped down firmly over my mouth, and an incredibly strong arm pinned my chest against the cold metal. I thrashed wildly for a split second before a familiar growly voice whispered directly into my ear. "It is just me, Dick. Stay perfectly still." Victor had arrived. He let go of my mouth and crouched beside me in the mud. He wore dark clothing and moved with a ghostly fluidity that defied his age. He did not ask me if I was okay. He simply analyzed the tactical layout in front of us with cold clinical precision. "Two Tango's heavy armor-suppressed rifles," Victor whispered, his eyes locked onto the targets. "We take them simultaneously on my mark. I take the one on the left. You take the right. Do not aim for the head or chest. They have Kevlar. Aim for the back of the knees. Drop them to the dirt, and I will handle the rest. Do you understand?" I nodded my heart, hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. I tightened my sweaty grip on the heavy iron crowbar. Victor held up 3 fingers in the pale moonlight. Then 2, then 1. We moved out of the brush like twin shadows. The element of absolute surprise was our only advantage. I rushed forward, closing the gap with a burst of desperate adrenaline I did not know I possessed. The guard on the right heard the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and began to pivot, bringing his weapon up toward my chest, but he was just a fraction of a second too late. I swung the rusted crowbar with all my strength, aiming low, exactly as Victor had instructed. The heavy iron collided with the back of the man's right knee with a sickening wet crunch. The guard let out a muffled, agonizing grunt as his leg completely buckled beneath him, dropping him instantly to the muddy ground. His weapon slipped from his hands, clattering harmlessly against the barn. Before he could attempt to recover, Victor was finishing his target. Victor had closed the distance in absolute silence, wrapping his massive forearm around the first guard's neck in an inescapable chokehold while simultaneously sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The guard thrashed violently, but the former Marine held him in a vice grip that entirely cut off the blood flow to his brain. Within 10 seconds, the man went completely limp, dropping into the mud like a discarded rag doll. My target was still writhing on the ground, frantically reaching for a tactical knife strapped to his thigh. I stepped forward heavily, slamming the heel of my thick work boot down onto his wrist and pinning his hand to the earth. Victor moved with terrifying speed, leaving the unconscious guard and diving onto my target. He delivered a single devastating strike to the side of the man's jaw. The guard's eyes rolled back in his head, and his body instantly went slack. The sudden violent scuffle was over in less than 30 seconds. The night returned to a dead, eerie silence, interrupted only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. I stood there in the dark, my chest heaving violently, staring down at the two unconscious men lying motionless in the dirt at my feet. My arms were shaking uncontrollably from the massive dump of adrenaline, and my knees felt like they were made of water. I leaned heavily against the cold metal siding of the barn, using the rusted crowbar to keep myself upright. Victor did not waste a single second celebrating our miraculous victory. He immediately pulled a bundle of heavy-duty plastic zip ties from his jacket pocket. He expertly rolled the first guard onto his stomach, crossing the man's arms behind his back and securing his wrists with ruthless efficiency. He did the same to the second guard, pulling the thick plastic bands so tightly they dug deeply into the flesh. Then he secured their ankles together, ensuring they could not walk or fight, even if they managed to wake up. "Keep an eye on the train," Victor muttered rapidly, patting down the tactical vests of the subdued men. "Make absolutely sure they did not leave a driver waiting back in that vehicle." I scanned the dark road, watching the unmoving silhouette of the black SUV parked in the distance. Nothing was moving. We were completely alone. Victor systematically stripped the men of their suppressed firearms, tossing the lethal weapons far out into the tall weeds where they could not be retrieved. He checked their ankle holsters, confiscating 2 sharp tactical knives, and then began digging through the deep pockets of their heavy combat pants. He pulled out encrypted cell phones, a small flashlight, and the sophisticated biometric scanner they had been trying to use on the barn door frame. I stepped closer, aiming my flashlight down at the items on the muddy ground. "See if they have identification," I whispered. Victor reached into the first guard's vest and pulled out a small object. He wiped mud off the surface and held it into the light. It was a sleek, heavy electronic keycard. The front was matte black, featuring a prominent silver logo. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at that logo. I recognized the shape instantly. It was the exact emblem printed on the business cards my son had proudly handed me 3 months ago for his brand new private investment firm in Los Angeles. My own flesh and blood had dispatched his corporate security operatives to murder me. Victor did not offer useless words. He simply pressed the key card flat against a hidden sensor on the barn frame. A loud electronic lock disengaged with a deep clack. I pulled the heavy corrugated metal door open. The inside of the structure was not filled with rotting wood or hay. I froze completely. Standing 3 feet inside the wooden facade was a massive reinforced steel bulkhead. It looked like the entrance to a military bunker, complete with thick titanium hinges and a glowing digital retinal scanner. I stood frozen in this cold air, staring at the digital retinal scanner mounted beside the steel bulkhead. The scale of the engineering hidden inside this rotting barn was staggering. The titanium hinges and reinforced steel plating were designed to withstand a military assault. Victor stepped past me, his combat boots making no sound on the concrete slab beyond the wooden threshold. He examined the door with the detachment of a man who had breached fortified compounds worldwide. He ran his gloved hand along the seamless edge where the steel met the concrete frame. "There are no wires, external power boxes, or keyholes," Victor stated quietly. "This is a closed-loop biometric security system. The key card we took from the guards was only coded for the outer facade. Getting through this inner bulkhead requires a direct retinal scan or a master override code entered directly into the keypad. We without biometrics blowing this door requires shaped charges we do not have." I stepped closer to the glowing red panel, my mind racing through decades of memories. Cameron and Monica clearly did not possess the required biometrics or the bypass code. This explained why they sent a specialized tactical team with an advanced hacking device. But this bunker did not belong to my son. It belonged to my wife. Sarah meticulously planned every detail of our lives' finances and future. She lived by spreadsheets, encrypted passwords, and fail-safes. If she had built this underground fortress in absolute secrecy, she would never have left me completely locked out. She knew my technical limitations, and she knew I would eventually find my way to this property. I stared at the keypad glowing beneath the optical lens, desperate for a solution. The blinking cursor demanded a 10-digit sequence. My chest tightened as a painful memory pushed to the forefront of my mind. I remembered sitting in the sterile hospital room during Sarah's final days. The cancer ravaged her body, and the heavy doses of morphine seemingly eroded her brilliant mind. During those agonizing last 48 hours, she had drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering quietly to herself. Cameron had stood in the corner of the room, checking his emails loudly, complaining that his mother was losing her grip on reality. At the time, I had sadly agreed with him. Sarah had kept repeating a specific random sequence of numbers, her frail fingers gripping my hand with surprising strength. 4792. She whispered those digits repeatedly, her cloudy eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity I foolishly chalked up to terminal delirium. I spent hours stroking her hair, telling her to rest, ignoring the vital message she was desperately passing to me before her final breath. She was not losing her mind. She was leaving me the key. A profound wave of sorrow and immense clarity washed over my tired body. Sarah had known her time was critically short, and she knew she could not trust our son. She used her final moments of lucidity to give me the exact combination I needed to uncover the truth. But 4 digits were not enough. The digital interface demanded a full 10-digit sequence. I closed my eyes, tuning out the low hum of the industrial power grid vibrating through the concrete floor. I needed to think exactly like Sarah. She was a woman of deep sentiment, wrapped in practical logic. If she needed a 10-digit code, I would never forget she would combine her secret numbers with the most important date of our shared lives. Our wedding anniversary, August 14th, 1982, 0814-1982. That was 8 digits. If I dropped the century, it became a 6-digit sequence, 081482. Combined with the 4 specific numbers she whispered on her deathbed, it equaled exactly 10 digits. Victor watched me in absolute silence as I reached my trembling hand toward the glowing red keypad. The cool night air seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a suffocating heavy tension. If I entered the wrong code, a system this advanced would trigger a hard lockdown, sealing the steel door and instantly alerting whoever was monitoring the security grid. I took a deep breath, letting the memory of Sarah guide my fingers. I typed the first 6 digits, 081482. The keypad emitted a series of soft electronic beeps registering the numerical input. I paused for a fraction of a second, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I entered the final 4 numbers she had given me, 4792. I pressed the green confirmation key and stepped back, holding my breath for 3 agonizing seconds. Absolutely nothing happened. The red optical scanner blinked rhythmically, silently, processing the numerical entry. Then the red light suddenly shifted to a bright, vibrant green. A deep, heavy mechanical thud echoed from within the thick steel wall. followed immediately by the unmistakable hiss of depressurizing hydraulic seals. The titanium hinges groaned loudly as the incredibly heavy bulkhead slowly began to swing outward, releasing a rush of crisp, perfectly chilled air into the dusty outer barn. Victor instantly raised his confiscated tactical knife, stepping protectively in front of me as the heavy door fully opened. But there was no immediate physical threat waiting for us inside the bunker. There was only the steady rhythmic hum of high-powered electronics. We stepped cautiously over the thick steel threshold and entered a completely different world. The interior of the bunker was a pristine, meticulously clean, climate-controlled environment. The walls were lined with thick soundproofing panels, entirely eliminating the howling wind outside. Bright, sterile LED lights automatically flickered to life, illuminating rows of towering black computer server racks. Thousands of green and blue lights blinked across the advanced hardware processing a massive amount of encrypted data. Thick bundles of black cables ran seamlessly from the servers into the concrete floor, drawing energy from the hidden industrial power line outside. This was not just a simple storage facility. It was a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar off-grid data center. Victor swept his tactical gaze across the humming machines, his sharp eyes scanning the room for hidden cameras or silent alarms. At the very back of the long rectangular room, past the endless rows of heavily encrypted servers, stood another massive titanium structure. It was a heavily reinforced walk-in banking vault gleaming under the bright fluorescent lights. The sheer amount of capital required to secretly build and maintain this subterranean infrastructure was absolutely astronomical. But it was not the towering servers or the imposing titanium vault that made my blood run entirely cold. Sitting perfectly centered on a polished stainless steel desk in the middle of the room, directly under a single overhead spotlight, was a pristine white envelope. I walked slowly down the aisle between the humming server racks, my heavy boots echoing loudly against the polished concrete floor. As I approached the desk, the bold, familiar handwriting across the envelope came into sharp, undeniable focus. It was written in thick black ink, addressed simply to me. For my beloved husband, Richard. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely pick up the pristine white envelope from the polished steel desk. The thick paper felt incredibly heavy, carrying the weight of a ghost speaking to me from beyond the grave. I ran my thumb over my name, tracing the familiar curves of Sarah's elegant handwriting. Beside me, Victor remained a stoic, silent guardian. He moved away from the center of the room, positioning himself strategically near the open steel bulkhead, his eyes constantly scanning the dark perimeter of the barn outside. He knew exactly what this moment meant to me, and he was ensuring that I had the uninterrupted time I desperately needed. I took a deep, ragged breath, letting the chilled, filtered air of the bunker fill my burning lungs, and carefully broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope. I unfolded the thick parchment paper. The date at the top of the page was written 3 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital for her final fatal decline. The ink was slightly smudged as if she had been crying while writing the words. I swallowed the thick knot forming in my throat and began to read. "My dearest William," she began, the words flooding my heart with a profound, agonizing sorrow. "If you are standing in this room, it means my absolute worst fears have been realized. It means I am gone. And it means you have finally followed the breadcrumbs I left behind to uncover the horrible truth about our family. I am so sorry for leaving you in the dark for the past 2 years. I needed to protect you, and the only way to keep you safe from the crossfire was to make you look like a harmless, ignorant old man. Please forgive my deception. I did not build this bunker because I was losing my mind, and I did not alter my last will and testament out of spite or cruelty. I did it because I discovered something truly terrifying about our son, and I needed time to secure our true legacy before he could steal it all and destroy everything we worked our entire lives to build." I gripped the paper tighter, my knuckles turning completely white. Sarah had always been a master forensic accountant, a brilliant woman who could spot a single irregular decimal point in a mountain of financial data. The letter continued detailing a nightmare I could scarcely comprehend. 2 years ago, Cameron asked me to review the initial financial ledgers for his new private investment firm. Sarah wrote. He thought I would glance at the top-line profits and congratulate him on his newfound success. But I looked deeper. I followed the hidden money trails, William. I tracked the complex routing numbers, the offshore shell companies, and the layered dummy accounts he and Monica were aggressively setting up. Our son is not a legitimate investment banker. He is running a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation for a notorious international cartel. He is moving millions of dollars of illicit drug money through the domestic real estate market, and he was quietly planning to use your development company as his primary washing machine. A wave of icy nausea washed over my body. My vision blurred as the horrifying reality of the situation crashed into my brain. The unmarked white pills, the sudden aggressive transfer of the luxury penthouse, the heavily armed tactical team sent to the remote farm. It all made perfect, terrifying sense now. Cameron and Monica were not greedy children waiting for an inheritance. They were desperate criminals trapped in a high-stakes underworld, and they viewed me as a massive liability that needed to be neutralized. If Cameron had succeeded in taking over my real estate portfolio, he would have dragged my clean name into a massive federal investigation. Or worse, put me into the crosshairs of a ruthless criminal syndicate. Sarah had figured it all out, and she had spent her final painful years meticulously sabotaging his sinister plans right under his nose. I wiped a single tear from my cheek and continued reading the next paragraph. I knew that if I confronted Cameron directly, he would panic and try to silence me, she explained. So, I played the role of a declining, paranoid mother. I used my extensive financial connections to secretly liquidate the vast majority of our liquid assets, our stock portfolios, our hidden mutual funds, and our overseas accounts. I quietly converted over $40 million into untraceable decentralized assets and secured physical bonds. I hid the true family fortune right here in this vault, entirely out of his reach. I left him the luxury penthouse and the visible bank accounts to serve as a shiny distraction, a temporary pacifier to keep him occupied while I finished securing our real wealth. He thinks he won, William. He thinks he outsmarted us both and walked away with the crown jewels, but he only took the bait. The very final few sentences of the letter were written with a fierce protective intensity that practically radiated off the page. The pen strokes were dark and heavy. I paused reading the most chilling revelation of all. If you are reading this, William, my heart finally gave out, or they helped it give out. Open the safe. Don't let our son destroy your life. The air in the bunker suddenly felt infinitely colder. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the devastating implication of those words hit my brain. Sarah had known her illness was terminal, but she also strongly suspected that Cameron and Monica were actively accelerating her demise to gain immediate access to the estate. They had probably used the exact same heavy sedatives on her that Monica had slipped into my hand just hours ago. They had murdered my beautiful wife. I let out a low, ragged sound of unadulterated anguish. Victor turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine with silent, supportive understanding. He did not speak, but the rigid posture of his body told me everything I needed to know. He was ready to go to war for me. I gently folded the heavy parchment paper and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. The profound grief that had been completely suffocating me for the past month rapidly began to transform into something entirely different. It condensed, hardening into a sharp, unbreakable spear of righteous fury. I was no longer an old, confused widower grieving the natural loss of his beloved wife. I was a man who had just discovered that his own son was a monstrous, greedy murderer, and my incredibly brilliant wife had just handed me the ultimate weapon to exact complete, devastating justice. I turned away from the steel desk and walked with slow, deliberate purpose toward the massive titanium vault dominating the back wall of the bunker. I reached out my fingers, no longer shaking, but perfectly steady and resolute. Using the final code in the letter, I spin the dial on the titanium safe. The heavy door swings open, revealing stacks of documents that will rewrite my entire existence. I stood there bathed in the cool, sterile light of the bunker, completely mesmerized by the contents stacked neatly inside the impregnable steel cavity. There were no piles of cash or glittering gold bars, but to a seasoned real estate developer, what I was looking at was infinitely more valuable. The shelves were meticulously organized with thick waterproof portfolios, ledgers, and banded stacks of heavy parchment paper. I reached out with trembling fingers and carefully pulled the first banded stack from the top shelf. They were bearer bonds. I flipped through the crisp embossed pages, my breath catching sharply in my throat as I mentally tallied the staggering denominations. There were millions of dollars held in these untraceable certificates alone. I set them down on the stainless steel desk next to Sarah's letter and reached back into the vault, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Next came thick files containing deeds and transfer documents for high-yield offshore accounts, established in secure jurisdictions far beyond the reach of American financial regulators or our greedy sun. Beside them sat heavily sealed envelopes containing extensive mineral rights and lucrative land patents for properties I did not even know we owned.